John chapter 9 is an incredible chapter, 41 verses, all about the story of a blind man that Jesus heals. He's blind from birth, and Jesus heals him. And it's a story, 41 verses of controversy about this guy's story. And the Pharisees come in, and they're pretty ticked off that Jesus has healed him on the Sabbath day. And they're continuously saying Jesus is a sinner because he's done this miracle on the Sabbath day. So there's a lot of controversy, 41 verses about it. And here's the bottom line. If Jesus is who he says he is, then we worship him. We don't just follow him. We're not just disciples of Jesus. We're worshipers of Jesus. But this whole story about a blind man being given sight is so helpful for us because it helps us to see the truth about who Christ is. What we have is some guys who think they have great sight into the things of God, the Pharisees, and a blind man who obviously has no sight. And across the span of 41 verses, what we have here is a man who's born blind. His sight gets increasingly clearer and clearer and clearer until at the end of the chapter in verse 38, he actually says, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped Jesus. And at the end of the chapter, unfortunately, the Pharisees, they actually say to Jesus, "Are we also blind?" Very snarky, you know, are we blind too? And Jesus says, if you would only say that you're blind. But no, because you still say, we see, we can see, because of that, your guilt remains on you. Some pretty sharp stuff here. The main thing I want us to see, and I want to ask you today, is do you really see Jesus? Do you really see Jesus for who he is? Because here's the thing, Jesus isn't just a man that we follow. He's not just a leader that I'm his disciple and you're his disciple. He's not just a good man who's given us a good example of how to love and be merciful and how to lift the lowly and have concern for the outcast. Those things are true, but that's not all that he is. The miracles, the signs that Jesus does, they're all signs pointing us to know who he really is. He's the Son of God. He's God himself. And because of that, the right response to Christ, to Jesus, is worship. Not just to follow his example, but to worship him for who he truly is. This chapter 9, 41 verses, is really showing a distinction between people who are caught up in thinking they're something that they're not, and they're unable to see the truth of who they really are because they don't see the truth of who he really is. Those people, the self-righteous, versus the blind man who's desperately looking for help and healing and who finds it in Jesus, and in the midst of that discovers who Jesus really is and sees that he's worthy of worship. This is the way it's going to be. This is the division for all time. There are going to be people who think Jesus is a great guy. He's a cool teacher. Or they're just going to reject him altogether and call him a sinner like these people do. Call him a terrible person, right? There's the rejectors and the worshipers. And that's really where the division is. There's no neutral ground. You can't look at Jesus and just say, well, he's a pretty good guy, yeah, but he's not God. If you say that, you really don't know who he presents himself to be. Because in the Bible, Jesus makes himself out to be God. And he says, you can either worship me or reject me. So here's the question for you. Do you have clear sight, spiritual sight, to see who Jesus really is?